Hi there, and welcome to the first in my series of videos on the census records. These are some of the most useful and accessible records for tracing ancestry in the UK. I'm starting with a series of videos on this fascinating family history resource to help you find your way around the records and avoid some of the difficulties of the census. However, for this video, I'm starting with the 1939 register, which isn't strictly a census record in the normal sense, but does have some similarities, and it helps to fill the gap that will be left by the gaps in the census records coming up in the future. The 1931 census was destroyed in wartime bombing, and the 1941 census was never actually taken because of the war. So the 1939 register goes some way to fill those gaps. If you're just beginning to research your ancestry, it's the first census-like record where you can view your ancestors as you go back in time. So if you're really starting from scratch, it'll probably one of the first records that you'll find useful online as you travel back in time. So what exactly is the 1939 register? Well, in 1938, when war seemed imminent, the government decided that if war were to break out, then a national register should be taken that would give details of the numbers and ages of the population, which would help in organising documentation such as identity cards and rationing. Now, obviously the war did break out, and that's exactly what happened. Now, since, I can't remember, about 3, 4, 5 years ago, we've been able to search the 1939 register online. And we can do this both on Ancestry now and on Find My Past. Find My Past was the first to release it online, but you can search it on Ancestry now. Now, it's the 1939 register for England and Wales is searchable on Ancestry and Find My Past. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, you'll need to contact the National Records of Scotland or the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And if you have ancestors living in either of those two places, then you should go to the relevant websites and follow the instructions there. But they'll be fairly similar to what we're going to go through here, so you can still follow this video. Now, unfortunately, the register does not cover the Channel Islands nor the Isle of Man. And this is bad news for me because both my parents and both sets of grandparents were living in the Isle of Man at the outbreak of the war, so I'm unable to find them on this register. In the following short video, I'll take you through a brief search of the register so you can see exactly what's in the register and some of its limitations. Okay, so by the way, it's no good searching for somebody who is still alive. There is a 100-year rule on the 1939 register, but if a death has been registered, they should show up. But obviously anyone who is still living won't show up for privacy reasons. So I'm going to just show you, I've got Find My Past up here and ancestry.co.uk. Just quickly show you how to find the 1939 census search page on here. It's straightforward on Find My Past, but Ancestry is a little bit more complicated. And assuming that you have a subscription to one or the other. So it's quite easy. If you're on Find My Past and of course logged in and everything, you just go to search, and if you look over to the right there it is. Very easy to find, and clicking on that will just take you to the search page. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Ancestry. Now it's a little bit more complicated here because you will see on the home page it doesn't come up straight away, and it doesn't come up on the search menu. So what we're going to do, the best way I've found to go to the register search page is go down to card catalogue and then just type in 1939 register. Do a search, and there it is. So you just click on there. Now I'm going to do the search on Ancestry because I'm assuming that probably most people have a subscription to Ancestry. I mean, some people will have both Ancestry and Find My Past, but I think on the whole, it's probably more likely you're using Ancestry. So we'll do this, and it's pretty similar on both. Now, as I said before, I don't have any direct ancestors on the 1939 register because they were in the Isle of Man. So I'm going to do a search for a great uncle. Now, I already know a little bit about him. I know his date of birth, and I know where he was living, and I do know the name of his spouse. So that makes things a lot easier. Obviously, you won't always have that information. So let's just start with the name. So his name was George, his last name Bott. Now, on the 1939 register, unlike all of the census records so far, you can put in an exact date of birth. In the other census records, it's just a year, certainly up until 1911. I don't know what the later ones will be like. But on the 1939 register, it does show on the register the exact date of birth. So if you know the exact date of birth, this is quite useful to enter that. And I do know that he was born on the 9th of July, 1876. And obviously if you don't have an exact date of birth, then put in the year, or if you don't know the exact year, on Ancestry you can put in up to 10 years either way. Obviously if you have it's a very common name, this is going to make things a lot more difficult, but that's pretty much across the board anyway on all records. So anyway, we're going to put in the exact year now. Now, this is where the 1939 register is limited. We cannot put in a place of birth because place of birth isn't given on the 1939 register. So it's very, very useful if you happen to know where they were actually living in 1939, or at least the county. And in fact, if you know the county, you can filter it down to that county anyway, over on the right here. But I'm just going to ignore that because it's just as easier to put it in here. And I know that he moved to Leicestershire. So we're going to put in Leicestershire now. And the one other thing I know about him was that he was married to Eliza Amelia Hunt. I'm just going to leave her name. I could put that in. I'm just going to leave that out just to see what comes up, and I can always put that in if I need to filter it down any further. So let's do a search. Oh, that's great. Got one of those little glitches. It's just all we need to do is click reload. There we go. Usually sorts itself out pretty quickly. Okay, so now you can see from here, and probably because I had the exact date of birth and I knew the residence, you can see something has come up. But notice here that in the transcript, it has been misspelt. Now, that's very, very common. Particularly, I find for names with a double T, often only one T might be crossed. So it does, I often find this name written in the transcripts as Bolt. So there's one thing you need to look out for in all the census records, and indeed any records you're searching for, and particularly the census records. I'll go into this more at a later date, but don't forget that the census records are copies of copies, and then they've been transcribed, so errors do happen. So if you can't find your name, your ancestor, sometimes it may be because they've been misspelt, so you need to try other spellings. So that is the only George Bott, and you can see actually somebody has come along and said that's not right, and actually has put in another possible name of George Bott, and we can all do that when we find a misspelling. It's given an alternative, which is very useful. So we've got the exact birth date, and it is Leicestershire, and we can see there also Eliza A. So this is definitely him. So let's click on the record. And we can see that it's actually Barrow upon Sower in Leicestershire, and we can use this little transcript here to check, but we do want to go straight to the actual record. Now, before I look at George himself, I'm just going to go to the top here and explain the columns to you. So we're in the borough, that's Union District or Registration District of Barrow upon Sower. And the first column shows you the address, and usually you'll have the road name at the top there, and it's all dittoed. So if you want to know the road name, you'll usually have to come up to the top here anyway. And it's Fairfield Avenue, and they're all, you can see they're all given the number. The second and third column you don't need to worry about. Those are just sort of schedule numbers used by administration. And then the fourth column are the names, the surname and any other name. And now this column here, you usually probably mostly don't need to use that, and it's for institutions only. So if your ancestor, say, turned up in a hospital or a prison, this little column would be give them what their role was within that institution, and these letters stand for officer, visitor, servant, patient, or inmate. Okay, so mostly, I mean, you can see on this page it's all residential, so that's not going to come up. Sixth column is M or F for male or female. And then the seventh and eighth column is the date of birth and the year of birth. And it's usually, because it's 1939, the shortened versions are often 18. So you can see there someone was born in 1871. And then the ninth column is whether single, married, widowed, or divorced. And the 10th column, the occupation, and I think the 11th column, usually there's nothing written in there. It may be relevant to possible War Office stuff. Right, so let's kind of come down to George. There he is. So from here, we can see that he was living at 14, what was it? Fairfield Avenue. And there we see, you can see his male, 9th of July, 1876, married, and he was a hosiery machine fitter. And there's his wife, Eliza A, female. She was born on the 5th of December 1877, married obviously, and she was a retired school teacher. Now, interestingly, you can see there are just 3 people in this household because you can see by the schedule number that goes on to the next household there and the street number. So there are just 3 people here, and there's a third one called Mary A. Hunt, which is quite interesting because Eliza Amelia's maiden name was Hunt. So if we look at the birth date, 4th of June 1864, she's about 13 years older than Eliza. So she's either a sister or possibly an aunt. And she's single and she is incapacitated. So she is obviously living with George and Eliza. Probably she's incapacitated, probably on a permanent basis. So that's quite useful. Finding other members of a family is always very useful in all the census records because it can help to identify. So, you could look for that person as well and hopefully tie them up together. So that's the information it gives us. No place of birth, as I've said, and also, unlike other census records, you don't see the relationships between the people in the household. Now, just one more thing or 2 more things rather, I should explain. You will see on probably all the pages, most, if not all the pages, these blanked out records where it says this record is officially closed. This is where there are entries where people are still alive. So very often in 1939, if a person was a child, very often that record will be closed. But if the death has been registered, then this will have been updated and it should show if the person has died. If it's not, then you can make a request for that record to be released. So that's that. Another thing you should note, interestingly, you may find that women in the 1939 register often show their married names as well, even if the marriage took place well after the 1939 register. And this is because the register was kept updated for quite a few years after 1939. It was updated until 1952 officially, and then I believe the National Health Service used it from 1948, and it's been updated by them up until 1991. So very often you will see both names, and this is really, really useful because you can actually search for a woman with both her married name and the maiden name, and that's really useful. If you only knew her married name, you could search her and find her, and actually find her maiden name, and possibly with her original family as well. So that would be very useful for searching females on this register. So that's about it. I hope you found that useful. The 1939 register is certainly useful for finding families and establishing a date of birth, and just finding out where people were and what they were doing in 1939. But it does have its limitations compared to the census records, and that is mainly that it does not show a place of birth, nor relationships between the household members. But it certainly is useful if you know very little about an ancestor in the early 20th century, and it can help to establish dates of birth, names of spouses, family members, and therefore help to find the ancestors in other records and the earlier census records. Another thing you can do on this register is to search for an address. And I think this is easier to do on Find My Past. So for example, if you're interested in looking at who was living in your house in 1939, you can do that too. And it can sometimes be useful in tracing ancestors. If you've had an ancestor living somewhere and you want to find out who was living there at another time in 1939, it can be useful occasionally for that too. But it's just another thing you can do on there. So I hope you found that useful. In my next video in this series, I'll be taking a look at the 1911 census. I'll see you then.